What does a just peace look like to you?
Безумовно, не втратити нашу суверенітет і нашу...
To not lose our sovereignty or our independence. We, no matter what, will take back what is ours, because we never lost it. The Russians took it from us, the temporarily occupied territories. We will not recognize as Russia those territories that the Russians temporarily occupy. We will bring them back. When or how, I cannot say.
Volodymyr Zelensky is trying to drive a wedge between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump as they're trying to find a way to bring this war to an end. And I guess I could really say Zelensky's trying to drive a wedge, and Zelensky and Europe is trying to drive a wedge between Putin and Trump, because they don't seem to want the war to end, at least not on the terms being discussed by those two right now. To try to make sense of this, we have probably our best military and European analyst, Col Jacques Baud, former NATO officer and Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service official. Colonel, been a while. Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me back. Thank you.
But look, let's just talk about, because it's made a lot of news in the United States today. I'm actually going to do a show on that whole 60 minutes interview that came out last night in the United States with Zelensky, because it is completely detached from what's been going on in all of this stuff from the time Trump came into office, and the conversations that's been going on between Vladimir Putin and Trump, or between Trump's emissaries and Russia's emissaries, et cetera. And then you have the European Union, some key members. I mean, not just Starmer and Macron, but also Kaja Kallas, Sikorsky from Poland, which we'll get to in just a second. But you still see this vast gulf between what the Trump and Putin are talking about and what everybody else is talking about. What do you make of that?
Well, there are different thoughts about this. First of all, of course, we have to understand that he is one of the parties of the conflict. So he has a view of the one who, I mean, there's a Ukrainian fighting for his country. So I have some understanding for what some things he said. The problem is that when you are in the lead position, you have to look at the reality. You cannot just having hope as a strategy. And that's a little bit the problem. And I understand that someone who is involved directly in the conflict may have a biased view on the conflict. What strikes me more is the behavior of those who are not directly involved in the conflict, and namely the Europeans. The issue of Trump, and again, I'm not sure Trump has addressed the problem properly with the proper strategy to achieve success, but that's another topic. At least with Trump, we have a will to do something. And that's already something, because so far no Western countries had any sense or willingness to do something, even to talk to the Russians. So at least we can give that as a credit to Trump. He wants to do something. He's ready to talk to the Russians. This is already a positive point. But Zelensky, that's where I don't understand. He sees that the situation is desperate on this country, and he has no plan to move ahead. I understand when he says we will not recognize the occupied country as Russian territory. I can understand that. If I were Ukrainian, I would probably say the same thing. The problem is, what is your strategy? What are you doing? So what? We don't agree. Okay, you don't agree, but what are you doing? What's your response to that? And that's where the problem starts, because he has no answer to the problem. He has no strategy. He failed systematically. He even engaged into operations such as the Kursk operation, the Zaporozhye operation, the Krinky operation, which were hopeless, which was just a waste of equipment. And
add Belgorod into that now.
Sorry?
Add Belgorod into that now.
And that comes into so all these operations were absolutely senseless. And So I don't know exactly how he wants to address the problem. I mean, he had the opportunity in April 2022 to have a solution, having the Russians out of the country with a few issues regarding Crimea and the Donbass to discuss, and that was to be discussed as stated in the document. But he refused that. So what's next, and
Yeah.
above all, what strikes me again, as I said, is the behavior of the Europeans. They have absolutely no strategy, because sending a couple of thousands of troops in Ukraine will not solve the problem. So we have kind of a show of force from Stormer and Macron, which is not a military show of force. It's more a political show of
Right.
force, because militarily that had no significance at all, and with no aim, with no objective, and that's the problem. And we again, and here we have the problem, the same criticism I have for Trump as for the others. The West is incapable of elaborating a strategy to address problems.
Yeah,
We have-
and and I want to get into that, specifically what some of the Europeans are saying in addition. But in kind of in our theme here about Zelensky trying to drive a wedge between the two, there was an event that happened in Sumy over the weekend that he is using as the cudgel to actually try to drive that in there. And there was an attack by 2 Russian missiles into the civilian city of Sumy, which killed, I think the last I saw was 30 civilians, wounded quite a lot more. And it was being decried in the West as just terrible war crime, and more evidence of the evil of the Russian side. You had Zelensky. I think you saw that picture Gary put up there a second ago, where he was making a big show of going to see some of the bodies, and was looking really distraught. And he's telling everybody that this is the reason why you can't trust anything Russia says. It's a mockery, I think was the way the headline was put in there, of this attempt that we're trying to do to find peace. And so it seems that they're trying to put pressure on the Trump administration to back off of the attempt to get some negotiated settlement. Now, this is complicated because there is other reporting that it wasn't merely Russia just arbitrarily deciding they're going to fire some missiles and blow up a bunch of civilians in the middle of this country. But according to a Ukrainian politician, she was very angry about this, because she says, Gary, if you can tell us, this Bazugli, I think her name is, I may be pronouncing it wrong there. But she says, listen, Russia fired in the center of Sumy on Palm Sunday, but she appealed to the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine and separately to the commander of the TRL. I can't remember what that stood for, but she said, listen, the issue here is that there was a military award ceremony being done in the middle of Sumy, which they knew. She claims that there was intelligence that Russia was planning to target this, because it was the 117th Brigade, which had taken part in the Kursk operation. And on the Russian side, they're claiming there was tremendous numbers of war crimes done by that unit against the civilian population before they were driven out, especially in the Suja area. And so she's saying, you were told this, and yet you continued to have it anyway. And it was in an area where lots of civilians were, so they got killed as well. So it seems to be a little bit more of a complicated situation. And I just wanted to see, first of all, if you had any knowledge about what happened in Sumy.
No, to be honest, I didn't dig into that. However, past experience shows that the Ukrainian narrative is built around the idea that it needs to have the support of the West. It requires the help of the West, otherwise it will not survive the war. And therefore, they are ready to any kind of narrative, including disinformation, of course, propaganda. And in the past, I don't know what really happened. And my position on this kind of situation is that we should have an international inquiry, a neutral, impartial, and that is that's how we will decide whether or not it's a crime. That's the same for Bucha. This is the same for other situations. The problem is that the Ukrainians have systematically refused to have an international inquiry on those. because and that's raised for me some suspicion that those allegations were not justified, and probably they used that as disinformation in order to mobilize the European, especially European countries, in favor of Ukraine. Now, we know by experience also that the Russians don't target civilians, and that was acknowledged from the very beginning of the special military operation. Even if I remember well, in the Newsweek magazine, there were a guy from the DIA, if I remember well, who was interviewed and said that he could notice that the Russians were extremely careful about the civilian population.
Yeah,
Because at the same time, you may remember that the Ukrainians were caught hiding military depots and missiles within commercial malls and civilian buildings. So here again, I don't know who is right, who is wrong. I have no idea, but I would suggest that before taking a position, we should ask for inquiry. That's my position.
That used to be the baseline intelligent position in the West, but it doesn't seem to be anymore, because, as I said, the title of this episode is that Zelensky tries to drive a wedge, but I think it probably should have more accurately been Zelensky and Europe try to drive a wedge, because some senior European leaders seemed all too eager to use this situation also to try to help drive that wedge. For example, senior EU diplomat Kaja Kallas said, listen, this thing's terrible, but the Russians are the bad guys.
We see the deadliest attacks. In this war, civilians are being killed, and of course, it is already 1 month into this period where Ukraine agreed to unconditional ceasefire. We haven't seen that from the Russia side. In this year, European countries have already committed to 23 billion euros. Which is more than last year, but we also need to put the pressure on Russia so that they would stop this war.
Okay, I want to talk about several things, because there's a number of really important things that need to be discussed in what she said there. I want to start with the last one, where she said, we really need to put a lot of pressure on Russia to end this war. The first question that I would ask is, hang on, because what about the previous 3 years when we put every pressure imaginable on Russia, and not only did it not destroy their economy grew at, I think the number is like 4% in the last year, while Europe was somewhere an anemic 1% overall. And militarily, they're much stronger there now. They're 500,000 larger on active forces than they were at the beginning. So what pressure does anybody in the European Union think they can bring that's going to make Russia back down on its war aims?
Well, that's exactly what I said before. The Europeans have absolutely no strategy for whatever. I mean, you can also address the question of tariffs. You can address the question of Palestine, of Iran. I mean, for each crisis that Europeans have, they're absent. I mean, the European diplomacy. I mean, Kaja Kallas is the head of the External Action Service of the European Union, which is basically some kind of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the European Union. But her only obsession, I would say, is Russia. There's absolutely no activity, no initiatives, no presence even in other crises, no idea, no strategy, no nothing. So we are always to the same narrative. The Russians are the bad guys, and we need to put pressure. But nobody says what kind of pressure. How do you want to achieve that? Do you combine pressure and rewards, something like the stick and carrot strategy? There is absolutely no. They were definitely not used carrot because they don't want to give anything to the Russians. Because Kaja Kallas comes from Estonia. Estonia is viscerally against Russians. I mean, they even voted very recently, the parliament, I think that was last week, they voted to prevent Russian living in Estonia to vote in local elections. So they deprive the Russian citizen, I mean the ethnic Russians living in Estonia from voting. You know,
Yeah,
this is
that's not.
this is
Yeah,
exactly as if you would deprive the vote for Latinos, or I don't know, in your country
Yeah.
or in my country. This is absolutely insane. And she comes from this country, which is, by the way, not even 1.5 million inhabitants in Europe.
Yeah.
You know, she's Minister of Foreign Affairs with one of the smallest country in European Union, which is decisively against Russia. So how can she have a kind of unbiased view on that?
Yeah, well, and then you also have to ask the question also in that clip there where in an attempt to make some kind of evidence that you suggested to back up how they're going to get this, they're going to say, she says, hey, we gave 23 billion euros. We just in the Normandy format that they just had in Germany, et cetera. And then the question is going to be, okay, 23 billion for the year 2025 is what they've said so far. Last year, the U.S. alone, in I think it was May of 2024, under the Biden administration, passed a 61 billion. So almost 3 times more. And if you look at the chart that shows, it's very interesting. From the time that money was allocated and over the next 6 months, the actual loss of Ukraine territory and personnel accelerated. So not only did it not roll Russia back, not only did it not stop, it actually, I don't know if it resulted in, but the net was a loss on the Ukraine side. Now you're talking a third that much money. What do they think that's going to buy on the battlefield?
Well, again, you know, they don't know. And that's exactly the problem. They don't have any objective. I mean, yes, the objective is Putin out of the country, out of Ukraine. But how do you want to achieve that? And that's where the idea of a strategy should be here. And there is none. So that should be a source of concern, because, okay, we can understand the Ukrainians are not happy to have Russians there. On the other hand, they provoked that by mishandling the Russian Ukrainians, because they were Russian Ukrainians, in fact, and that's exactly what triggered the intervention in February 2022. So they have some responsibility in that, even if the Russians, in fact, came with their army in the country. But again, this was to protect the population. So the first problem is that they were not able to protect their own population. They shot at their own population. And now they are complaining because of the consequence of that. But they never managed to say how they want to get out of the crisis. You know, and the exit strategy is totally absent from Ukraine and from Europeans. And
now, it could be that when you're talking about exit strategy and this whole wedge driving thing here, let's look at somebody else from the European side, and that is Foreign Minister Sikorski from Poland. Now, Poland is not, a small country like Estonia. They, if I'm not mistaken, they either had the first or the second largest land army in Europe. But he is also looking at trying to take this situation that happened in Sumy, and I think that he's directing something here towards Donald Trump.
Ukraine unconditionally agreed to a ceasefire over a month ago. The heinous attacks on Kryvyi Rih and on Sumy is Russia's mocking answer. I hope that President Trump, the US administration, see that the leader of Russia is mocking their goodwill, and I hope the right decisions are taken. Thank you.
Yeah, so he's saying, I hope the right decisions are taken. So it seems that he's trying to encourage President Trump to reverse course, not to end the war, but to go back to the Biden situation. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, that certainly would seem to be his intent, Sikorski, and many other like-minded, not the least of which is Macron and Keir Starmer. But again, you have to say, all right, for 3 years, you had that kind of support, and it
Exactly.
did not stop either the Russian offensive, and it didn't help the Ukraine offensive. So again, you have to ask, upon what are you basing this hope?
Well, this is exactly the problem. There is absolutely no willingness, in fact, to move ahead. First of all, Sikorski speaks about the ceasefire, the unconditional ceasefire that was incidentally, he said proposed by the US, not by Ukraine, which is interesting, which reflects, in fact, the communique of the State Department, who said it was a US proposal. So Ukraine didn't want, in fact, a ceasefire. But that's the first thing. But let's put it aside. The thing is that the reason why Putin didn't want this ceasefire is that the ceasefire was not leading to something. And if you read exactly what Vladimir Putin said in last June in 2024, he explained to the officials of the foreign ministry, he said there will be no ceasefire, saying that there will not be ceasefire hanging in the air. But if Ukraine is ready to negotiate on the basis of our terms, and namely the abandon of the 4 region and the non-membership, to abandon the membership to NATO, if they agree to negotiate on that, will ceasefire immediately. And he used the word ceasefire. That's in the transcript of the Kremlin readout.
Well, in fact, here's a comment from Putin himself on the 15th of March, just barely almost a month ago now, where he reiterated exactly that thing.
We agree with the propositions to stop hostilities, but we proceed from the fact that such ceasefire should be such that would lead to a permanent peace and remove the original causes of the crisis.
Yeah, Russia constantly goes back to that issue about they want to go back to the root causes, the original causes, he said in that clip there. And yet the West never even addresses those.
We don't even listen to the Russians. It's interesting when you see all the proposals that are on the table, they never take Russian conditions into considerations. I mean, of course, the proposition of Case Kellogg's are very clear. I mean, they doesn't even consider that. Probably now he accepts the fact of the 4 regions being part of Russia, at least temporarily. But here, this is a problem. If you want a negotiation, means that you have to talk and to listen to the other. At the end of the day, an agreement is an iterative process between the two parties. You have the conditions, and you have to, by discussion, to reach the point where both parties agree to what the other says. I mean, we used to say when I worked in the as military advisor to the foreign ministry in Switzerland, we said a good agreement is where nobody is happy with the result. Meaning that you have to adjust, and this is an iterative process. And it's not just take it or leave it. And that's a little bit the approach that we have seen so far. I mean, you come and you say, okay, we do a ceasefire, period. And I think the Russians have a more traditional understanding of that. And they say, okay, you propose a ceasefire. Now we need to have some nuances, as Vladimir Putin said about this. Meaning that you have a first proposal. Okay, let's talk about this. Let's amend this. Let's discuss, and the discussion will go back and forth until both parties agree to that. And if you look at the process that we had, for instance, in Palestine, was also the ceasefire. But a ceasefire was designed to lead somewhere. You had a first phase, which is not even implemented so far, but at least there were a plan with a first phase, a first step, a second step, and a third step. So you have the start of a process. It's not just stopping firing for a couple of hours or days. It is the idea that you stop firing, but you build on that. And that's exactly what was missing from the various proposals. I mean, the Black Sea agreement that was agreed between the U.S. and the Russians were an attempt to reach some kind of success, probably. And that was probably the name of the game that was for the Trump administration to show some achievement, probably. And it even realized that because they underestimated the resistance of the European Union. But it's again, it's another issue. But what I want to say is that just thinking that a ceasefire will solve the problem is almost childish, because we have a very complex situation that started, as I said, with the problem of the population in Donbass, not just in Donbass, by the way, but in the whole southern part of Ukraine. And there is something we tend to forget, and that explains why the Russians will not give back those 4 regions. Is that you have a law in Ukraine that was a law passed by the Ukrainian Rada on the 1st of July 2021 that gives different rights for the Russians as for the rest of the Ukrainians. So the Russians living in Ukraine have different rights from the others. So it's not a society like yours where everybody has the same rights, basically. Here in Ukraine, it depends on your ethnicity. That some have compared this law, although it's not exactly the same. When you read them, it's slightly different. But the spirit is the same as the laws you had in 1935 in Germany that granted different rights to the ethnic Germans and those Germans who were not of German extraction, like the Jews, for instance.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the pattern of this law of July. And for the Russians, this, and you may remember that just after this law was passed in the Rada, on the 12th of July, the same year, Vladimir Putin wrote a very long article about the unity of the Ukrainian people, explaining that there is no reason to make a difference between ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians and all that, because in fact they share a lot of history together and so on and so forth. And that was very much misinterpreted in the West, basically, because a lot of people ignored or wanted to ignore this law, which is based on ethnicity. It's a law that grants rights not on the basis of what you do, but on the basis of what you are. And that's...
that is part of the frustration. You talk about diplomacy and what some of the Western diplomats are doing. The Russian side, of course, head by Sergei Lavrov, also has his own frustrations because he said, when I look at what the Europeans are doing, it seems more like they're trying to negotiate more war than towards peace.
Exactly.
All of these Euro-Atlantic constructions, I think they failed. They failed to consolidate security and stability. What they succeeded in is igniting tension and remilitarizing Europe, including Germany, in spite of the fact that the economic and social situation is degrading. But all efforts of this Euro-Atlantic community are concentrated on getting ready for a new war. And Germany, together with France and Britain are in the lead of this.
So if you have and I just put there Sikorsky and Kaya Kallas, and then you have Lavrov on this side here. When you have that much of a gap, there's really not a whole lot of wedging to be putting in here, because they're like talking way in the opposite directions here. How can any kind of negotiated settlement come when you have the two sides that are talking so far apart?
Well, first of all, that explains why you have talks just between Russia and the US, because there is no European diplomacy anymore. I mean, I mentioned the different crises we have right now with Iran, Palestine, and all that. Nobody talks about European diplomacy, not even at European level, but also at a level of the countries. I mean, the French diplomacy is just there to portray the Russian threat, but not to solve the problem and to try to solve the tension. The idea of diplomacy, and that's why you have the Vienna Convention that grants immunity for the diplomats, is because the diplomats are supposed to smooth the angles in the case of friction. That's why you have a diplomacy. It's precisely to solve those issues. And this is exactly where the European diplomacy is absent from. So we are in a deep crisis here, in internal crisis of the West. I mean, Europe probably more than the US, because regardless of what we think about Blinken or Rubio or whatever, at least the US diplomacy is listened to, or to some extent, at least. But it's there. It's there. When you have a crisis in Iran, everybody looks at the US diplomacy, not at the European diplomacy. If you look at the JCPOA, for instance, where the joint comprehensive agreement for the nuclear force in the nuclear issue in Iran, European Union was part of this agreement. But when you come to discussions with Iran, nobody talks about the European diplomacy anymore. So there is no European diplomacy, and even if they were, again, what would be the strategy? What would they want to achieve? And this is exactly, I think, the crisis in the West is not just economic and political. This is also institutional, because the role of diplomacy has just totally disappeared. So how can you have a foreign policy without diplomacy? You know, if you talk about a foreign policy, you talk about Keir Starmer, you talk about Emmanuel Macron, but both are, I mean, one is prime minister, the other is president. They are not ministers of foreign affairs. When you talk about foreign policy of the US, you talk about Rubio. I mean, Trump does his part of the foreign policy as well. But I mean, I have a feeling that there is less of an institutional crisis. I mean, you probably have a different feeling in the US. I don't know. But my feeling from seeing that from Europe is that you have less an institutional problem in the US as regard to foreign policy as we do in Europe. I mean, in Europe, there is absolutely no foreign policy. It's what Macron says and what Keir Starmer says, period. And for the rest, you have those who shout and jump around like the tabaki, as Vladimir Putin called them. This is the small animal in the, I think it was the Jungle Book of this cartoon. In any case, a small animal that runs around and shouts, but it does nothing. It just shouts. And you have those tabakis in Europe. Estonians are like this. Kaya Kallas is like this. Annalena Baerbock is like this. Liz Truss, all these people, there's all tabakis that shout without make noise, but don't act. They are not able.
So let me ask you this question. Well, let's take all of those figures you just mentioned on the Western side, and they have an objective. They have an intent. They would like Russia to lose. They would like Ukraine to win. They want Russia to be weakened, whatever. We can dispute and certainly do about the possibility that succeeds within the Russian side, within the European side. But when you have the president of the United States unequivocally saying, I'm going down a different path, what sense does it make for the Europeans to ignore stuff like what he said last night?
Do you have a reaction to Russia's Palm Sunday attack on Ukraine?
I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing.
You said they made you were told they made a mistake. Do you mean it was unintentional?
They made a mistake. I believe it was. Look, you're going to ask them. This is Biden's war. This is not my war. I've been here for a very short period of time. This is a war that was under Biden. He gave him billions and billions of dollars. He should have never allowed it. Remember this. This is Biden's war. I'm just trying to get it stopped so that we can save a lot of lives. They happen to be Ukrainian and Russian lives. But all I want to do is get it stopped.
So you see that last part. All I want to do is get it stopped. He's only focused on ending the war. He's not looking to make Russia pay a price, to put more money into it, etc. So given that, what possible sense does it make for all of this European diplomatic people that you just mentioned trying to go in a different direction?
Well, Trump has an advantage because he's new, as he just said in your video. He's new. So he doesn't need to adopt this war. And as he said very clearly, this is Biden's war. This is not mine. And that's an advantage. I mean, Macron was there from the very beginning to now, so he cannot say that. You see, that's exactly the problem, and that's where I see the Europeans are missing a point, because they could take advantage of this, because Trump has understood that he can play with that. I mean, some people said in Europe, even on the right-wing side, they said, well, US has acknowledged its defeat. No, it's not true, because that's the Biden's defeat. It's not Trump's defeat. And that's a fantastic advantage for Trump, because he can start from a blank sheet. And that's something that the Europeans don't have. And the problem Trump has is that the longer he stays negotiating with Russia and that, the more this war will be his war.
Right.
That's the problem. Yep. And that's a risk. So that's why, ideally, and that's probably why he said, well, that was a rhetoric formula, I think. But when he said, I will stop this war within 24 hours, I'm sure he didn't mean that, but it didn't mean that. But yeah, that's in any case, the shorter time it will take to solve the problem, the best it will be for him. Because now it's slowly becoming his war. You see?
Right, so and I think that he's going down this path and reiterated there. And by the way, just in messaging, the fact that he so strongly reiterated this was Biden's war last night, that's new. He kind of had insinuated a few things before, but we'll see what goes on forward, because if he starts really harping on that theme, I think that's going to imply that he's getting ready to either cut a deal with Russia or say, you guys are on your own. You can keep going if you want to try between Europe and Kiev. We'll see how that's going to play out. But I think one of the reasons that he's going down that path is because if you look at the recently released U.S. Intelligence assessments called the Annual Threat Assessment, that was, I think, 2 weeks ago, they released it on a Monday, and it basically said Russia is going to win the war. The Ukraine side doesn't have the capacity with all this, so we need to find a negotiated solution. There is no possibility to win. And then you have actually today, or maybe it was yesterday, in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, the Zurich Zeitung. Forgive my pronunciation there.
Neue Zürcher Zeitung.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you're obviously a little better at that than me. We had Colonel Reisner, who we've shown a few clips on here before, who is an Austrian colonel. So he's, not pro-Russia. He's not even pro-European Union because Austria is not in NATO. But he has proven very, very effective in his analysis, in my view, from the beginning of this war. And he said, according to this article here, compared to the past, Putin seems much more self-confident. The Russian president has recently issued a decree obliging 160,000 men to perform military service. For Reisner, this is a remarkable step. To put it drastically, the Russians feel like they are in April 1945 on the Silo Heights with their eyes on Berlin. They believe that victory is within reach. First of all, I want to look at the military aspect of that. Do you concur with Colonel Reisner that Russians, whether you think they are or not, but that the Russians believe that they're on the cusp of something that they are inevitably going to win?
Well, I think the Russians are very conscious about this. I mean, and everybody says so. The aim of the Russians was not to take territory, but to destroy the military potential of Ukraine. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today. It's the systematic destruction of a potential. Remember what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February, 2022. The two objectives were demilitarization and denazification. And this objective of demilitarization is exactly what's happening. The problem is that in the West, we tend to measure success in the number of square kilometers that were gained by the parties. That's probably valid for the Ukrainian side because the objective is obviously to recover the territory they have lost. So for them, you can measure the success in square kilometers. But when you address the Russians, then you should measure the success in the number of Ukrainians killed. That's where you measure the success. The problem is that we don't know these figures because obviously they are classified, but that would be the real measure of success for the Russians. And indications are, as of today, that the Russians are winning this war. And I think that's not a surprise because we have witnessed that since, in fact, I would say the second half of, in fact, if we are honest, the Pentagon felt that already in November 2022.
Yeah.
When they asked the Ukrainians to start opening a dialogue with the Russians because they felt that it was lost. The so-called summer offensive on 2023 was almost kind of a coup de grace because they invested so much equipment in that offensive and that everything was destroyed. And now they have the Russians are systematically and progressively destroying the human potential. I mean, what you see, for instance, on the battlefield, when you see the pictures of Kursk and all these places, you see only Western material, Western equipment. You don't see the original Russian manufactured equipment that Ukrainians had from it because it doesn't exist anymore. The Ukrainians are relying exclusively on Western equipment, meaning that the army they had in February 2022 has been completely destroyed.
Yeah, and in fact, Colonel Reisner actually seems to agree entirely with your assessment of things. That article went on to say that there are several areas along the front that are favorable for Russian operations, from Sumy region north to the Donbass and the southern Zaporizhia. The military expert said, according to him, the Russians could try a breakout to potentially get a large piece of Ukraine in the northeast province. The big mistake in Western thinking, he said, is to measure military success by territorial gains, because this is a war of attrition. This means that success is not defined by land gains, but by resource consumption, and that also means people. And, militarily speaking, it seems inevitable that at some point, and I can't, I don't have enough knowledge about what the inputs are, but at some point it seems logical to assume that this resource, both personnel and military gear, et cetera, and ammunition, et cetera, could get to some low point to where there could be a collapse of the ability to resist. And then all of a sudden you can just drive into the country and you don't even have to worry about seizing every village by village because there's no more the ability to defend it. How do you see that?
That's what I have written in my book, the book which is behind me right here, the Russian Art of War. The Russians, the Russian military doctrine is essentially based on Clausewitz thinking. And Clausewitz always said, when you want to win a war, you have to address or destroy its forces. This is, in essence, this is attrition, the idea of attrition. You destroy the forces, the military forces. That should be your main, your priority. And the Russians are exactly applying that. And they knew from the very beginning that they would not take the whole Ukrainian territory. This was very clear from the very, very beginning. And now they are just systematically applying their military doctrine. And we are what we are witnessing today is exactly what could be predicted. I mean, my book was published last year. It reflects also some thoughts that I wrote already in October 2022. So meaning that in 2022, you had already an idea of how this conflict would end. And that's exactly what we have today. The problem is that the West is so obsessed with the idea that Ukraine must prevail, so obsessed that the Russians must be defeated, that we just discarded everything. And today we are trapped by our own narrative, in fact. The Europeans are trapped in their own narrative because, and that probably explains why their only resort today is to continue put billions in Ukraine, even if everybody knows that it will fail. So I would say today that, in fact, if I were Russian, and that's a very cynical approach, because obviously that will cost lives for both sides. But if I were Russian, I would say, well, Europeans are helping us because they are making Ukraine continue making war and will destroy systematically. I mean, remember what Vladimir Putin just said a few days ago. He say, I don't remember exactly the context, but he said, we'll finish them out.
Yeah. We'll finish them. Yeah, I remember we actually talked about that. And, it's ironic, if not outright perverse, that while you have the Trump administration trying to find a negotiated settlement, trying to find a way to get this war over with, aside from what you just said there, I think that Zelensky is basically providing even more for the Russian side to be able to say, we don't have to worry about having anyone agree to negotiation. We're just going to continue to grind until the collapse. When you hear Zelensky saying stuff like this.
Absolutely necessary for this war to finally end. And it must end at the negotiation table. Only the most difficult conditions for Russia on the battlefield and in international relations can force it to do what's needed for a true peace. And today marks exactly 1 month since Russia rejected the US proposal for a full and unconditional ceasefire. 1 month that has made it completely clear Russia is the sole cause of this war. Without strength against Russia, there will be no will in Russia to accept and implement any realistic and effective proposals for peace.
Yeah, well, he's right. There's not going to be any instrument to force Russia. Ergo, what their current course of action is the only one left to them. When Russia hears Zelensky on the other side of this, no matter what Trump is saying, I'm not even interested in peace on terms that you've laid out. I'm only interested on terms that I want, which of course Russia will never agree to for all the reasons you've already pointed out. I mean, do you see any other way this can go other than that Russia will just keep fighting?
Well, we are back to the peace plan of Zelensky of last year. You remember this peace plan that which was in essence, we want a peace, so Russia must capitulate, and that will be peace. And that's exactly what he's saying today. And what I mean, he didn't mention his own plan, but the same idea, meaning that the international community should put pressure on Russia to give up with fighting, and that's totally delusional. The problem I see is that the U.S. and the Trump administration here doesn't push or press enough Zelensky to agree on realistic terms. And my view is that if you want a negotiation, if you want something to achieve some result, there is no alternative to listen to the Russians first. At the end of the day, they are the winning party. They are, in fact, they decide what's happening. Therefore, you have to listen to them. And then we have to convince the Ukrainians to go along with that. I mean, there will probably be some adjustments, probably, but the baseline, I think it's unavoidable to have the Russians to tell what are the baselines for these negotiations. The problem is,
sorry, go ahead.
So, the issue is that the unavoidable fact is that they are winning, and even if Zelensky says what he just said on your video, how does he want to achieve what he asked for? We are back to the same problem. What is the strategy to do what he wants to do? You can make pressure, but as you've said before, in the last 3 years, the West has put together some kind of 17 different sanction packages. You had all kind of sanctions and pressure and whatever, and even what the New York Times recently published with this task force Dragon and helping and providing the intelligence, real-time intelligence to Ukraine. This was not enough to defeat the Russians. So meaning that there is a point where you have to come to the reality and say, well, if we continue on that path, the result will be exactly what Putin said. He will finish them out.
And let me in the last few minutes we have here, I wanted to just, as best you can, to define what you think that would look like, because I have argued that if the negotiations, the ugly deal that it could still be on the table for the Ukraine side, if they don't take that diplomatically, then it turns to the military side that Russia will compel them by force of arms to take what they want, but it won't stop at the June 14 line from last summer. It probably goes to the Dnieper River. How do you see it playing out if Russia has to conquer militarily?
Well, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but some talk about taking Odessa, and that's probably something that would, at least psychologically and politically, would be a very strong issue. I don't know if the Russians would be ready to do that, because they probably don't want to fight in Odessa. Again, I don't know exactly, and probably the next month we have addressed this question already. all the situation within Ukraine will change. We see, if you read Ukrainska Pravda, other, they are more and more critical. They talk more about the incidents that that the Ukrainian soldiers are experiencing. So they are less, I mean, the press is less delusional as it used to be before. And that's probably a sign that probably something may change politically in Ukraine. And that's probably the solution. Again, to have a solution, again, if you had somebody else than Zelensky in the country, that would give the same situation as Donald Trump today. Can say that was another war.
Yeah.
Else, and now I decide that because it's difficult for Zelensky, who have been back and forth, and today I think Zelensky must regret probably not having accepted the deal he had already signed in April 2022, and now it's very hard to say I made a mistake. Especially,
he can say that. I'm sure maybe privately he does, but I'll tell you who regrets it more, and that's the family members of all these men who have died in between now and then. And I'm sure that there's lots in Ukraine who are still alive that want desperately for this war to end, so their loved ones don't join that, grave capacity. But anyway, but that's just where we are right now. We're putting this out there. This is the truth, and we're going to continue to show this truth there. And there's the Russian art of war that Colonel Baud mentioned there. If you want to read any more on that to see how that's lining up with what we actually see on the battlefield, he's been calling this for a long time. We really appreciate you coming on today, Colonel, and look forward to seeing you back again real soon.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we'll also come back and see you this afternoon. I think at 2:00, we're going to look at that specific issue of the 60 Minutes that Zelensky was on last night. A lot of propaganda in there you may not be aware of. We're going to point it out to you so you know what's real on that. Look for us at 2 p.m. this afternoon, and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.